Tonight, we step into a world both recent and distant. A time when entire villages were asked to dream of miracles, even as their stomachs whispered otherwise. It is the late 1950s in rural China. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. A red banner flutters against the pale dawn, its slogans bright and bold against the quiet of the fields. Farmers gather in the courtyard of a commune, their faces lit by the soft glow of lanterns. Some wear expressions of pride, others of uncertainty. All of them are listening to words that promise a leap so great it would carry the nation into a new future. But behind the slogans and the speeches lies a silence, the scrape of an empty bowl, the hush of whispered doubts behind mud brick walls, the soft creak of a wooden door as someone steps into the night to search for what little food can still be found. This is not the story of leaders alone, but of the millions of men, women, and children who carried the weight of a dream and the cost it demanded. So, settle in, breathe slowly, and let us walk together through the villages, the fields, and the quiet halls of the Great Leap Forward, not to rush, not to judge, but to listen, to remember. The dream of a leap forward. Before the great noise began, before the slogans echoed from the loudspeakers and the sky glowed orange from the furnaces, there was a different kind of sound in the countryside of China. It was a rhythm, a cadence that had governed life for more than 1,000 years. It was the sound of the seasons turning, as predictable as the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. It was the soft rhythmic splash of water as it was paddled from the canal into the terraced rice paddies, a sound that spoke of patience and persistence. It was the gentle creak of a wooden plow pulled by a steadfast ox, tracing the same lines in the earth that a man's great-grandfather had traced before him. This rhythm was the heartbeat of a life defined by the soil. And every village families understood the language of the land. They knew the scent of the morning mist as it lay heavy over the fields, a cool and damp promise of the day's labor. They knew the particular weight of a bamboo basket when it was filled with freshly harvested cabbage, and the satisfying ache in their shoulders that came with it. They knew the deep, earthy smell of the soil after a summer rain, and the quiet warmth of a packed earth fire in their own hearth on a cold winter night. This life was a story of endurance, a narrative written not in books, but in the callous lines on their hands and the deep-set wrinkles around their eyes. It was a life of hardship, of droughts and floods, of lean years and years of modest plenty. But it was a story they understood. It was predictable. It was their own. Then a new story began to be told. It did not rise from the earth, but seemed to descend from the sky, carried on the wind and through the earnest, excited voices of officials who arrived from the distant cities. These men, dressed in simple, uniform-like blue or gray tunics, looked different. They spoke with accents that were crisp and unfamiliar, and their eyes held a fiery conviction that was both captivating and unsettling. They would gather the villagers in the central square, often under the shade of an ancient banyan tree where generations had gathered for festivals and markets, and they spoke of a future so bright, so magnificent, that it was difficult for the villagers, whose lives were painted in shades of brown and green, to even fully imagine. They spoke of a new China, a nation that was no longer sick and weak, no longer humbled by foreign powers. This China, they said, was about to stand up, shake off the dust of centuries, and leap into a new age. It would not just walk or run, but fly. It would soar past the old powers, the nations like Britain and the United States, which had taken centuries to build their industrial might. China, they promised, would do it in a decade. This great national project was given a name that was as bold as its promise, the Great Leap Forward. The name itself was a declaration of intent, a rejection of the slow, incremental progress of the past. It was a promise of instantaneous transformation. Red banners, the color of revolution and good fortune, began to appear, their brilliant cloth a stark contrast to the weathered gray stone of the village walls. On them, bold, calligraphied characters proclaimed the new reality. Enter communism in a single step. The people's communes are heaven. In every home, in every quiet conversation, the message was the same. You stand at the very edge of a glorious new age, an age where hunger would become a forgotten word, a ghost from a primitive past. An age where the nation's industrial strength would be forged not in faraway urban factories, but right here, in the soil of their own courtyards and the fire of their own hands. The dream was a powerful elixir, a potent mixture of hope and national pride. It painted a breathtaking picture of collective purpose, a vision where every single hand, every willing heart was an essential part of one single mighty, unstoppable effort. The individual would dissolve into the collective, and from that unity, a modern paradise would be born. For people who had only ever known the struggle for their own family's survival, the idea of being part of something so vast, so historic, was intoxicating. The dream settled over the land, a heavy, shimmering blanket of possibility, and under its weight, the ancient rhythms of the countryside began to falter, preparing for a new, faster, and more demanding beat. Mao's vision and the people's hope. The architect of this monumental dream was a figure who, for most of the villagers, was more of a legend than a man. His name was Mao Zedong. His face, serene and paternal, was everywhere. On posters in the village square. On the front page of the newspapers the cadres read aloud. In the small, revered portraits that were beginning to appear in homes. For tens of millions of people, his words were not simply policy proposals or political speeches. They were treated as prophecy, as infallible truths that held the key to the nation's destiny. His vision was of a China utterly reborn, a nation that would purify itself of its past weaknesses and exorcise the ghosts of what was called the Century of Humiliation, a period of subjugation by foreign powers. Mao believed with an almost religious fervor that the true, inexhaustible strength of China was not in its limited number of machines or its underdeveloped infrastructure, but in the revolutionary will of its people. The population, nearly 600 million strong, was not a burden, but China's greatest asset. He saw them as a blank sheet of paper on which the most beautiful new characters could be written. If this immense human energy could be harnessed and directed towards a single goal, he argued, there was nothing it could not achieve. The people, united and inspired, could literally move mountains. They could tame the wild rivers that had plagued China for millennia, and they could construct an industrial paradise almost overnight. This message resonated with a profound and powerful harmony in the hearts of a people who had known little but struggle, poverty, and political chaos for generations. It offered a sense of agency, a feeling of empowerment that was entirely new. The future was not something that would be benevolently given to them by a distant government. It was something they would build with their own hands, their own sweat. The promise was not just for a better life, but for a meaningful one. Every shovel of dirt, every stalk of wheat harvested would be a blow against the old world and a brick in the foundation of the new. The leader's words painted vivid, alluring pictures of this future. Pictures of communal granaries so full that the doors would not close. Pictures of fields yielding impossible harvests, with wheat stalks growing as thick as bamboo. And most powerfully, pictures of steel, the symbol of modern industrial power, flowing like a river from thousands of small furnaces across the entire country. This vision stirred a deep and genuine sense of national pride. After a century of being told they were backward, the people were now told they were the vanguard of history. It was an intoxicating reversal. But alongside this swelling wave of hope, a quieter,
more unsettling current began to flow. The vision, in its beautiful and absolute totality, demanded absolute unity. It required a complete surrender of the individual will, individual knowledge, and individual life to the needs of the collective. The old ways of thinking, the peasants' cautious, experience-based wisdom, were now dismissed as conservative, backward, even selfish. To doubt the new methods, to question the pace, to express any hesitation, this was not seen as prudent skepticism. It was seen as a lack of faith, a flaw in one's revolutionary spirit. To doubt the vision was to doubt the party, to doubt Chairman Mao, and ultimately to doubt the future of China itself. And so, as the people listened to the promises broadcast from the loudspeakers, their genuine hope for a world without hunger was inextricably mingled with a new, unspoken fear. It was the fear of being found wanting, of being left behind by the great tide of history, of being identified as an obstacle to the magnificent dream that was beginning to reshape their world with astonishing speed. They applauded, they chanted the slogans, and they hoped with all their hearts that the beautiful pictures painted by their leader would become real, while a small, quiet voice in the back of their minds wondered at the cost.
Collectivization begins. The great dream of a unified, leaping nation could not be built upon the old foundations of private life. The very concept of private ownership, a family's small plot of land, their trusted farm animals, their personal tools, was seen as a relic of a slower, more selfish, and inefficient past. It was the source of capitalist thinking, a barrier to the pure, selfless, collective spirit required for the communist utopia. And so the first and most profound tangible change was the end of the private field. For countless generations, a family's identity, their history, and their future were all tied to the small patch of earth they cultivated. It was the land where they had buried their ancestors, the source of their food, and the legacy they hoped to pass on to their children. Now, this deeply personal connection was to be severed. Cadres walked the fields with surveyors, and the ancient boundary stones that separated one family's plot from another were unceremoniously pulled from the earth and cast aside. The low earthen walls and bamboo fences came down. In their place, vast, unbroken fields stretched to the horizon, a single entity belonging to the new institution, the People's Commune. Neighbors, who had for centuries worked their own land side by side in a complex web of cooperation and competition, were now told they were all members of one great single household. The land, the cadres explained, now belonged to everyone, which in practice meant that it belonged to no one in particular. It was an abstract concept managed by the state.
With the land went the tools of life. The sturdy iron-tipped plow, perhaps a family's most valuable possession, which had been carefully oiled and maintained for decades, was taken away to a communal shed. The sharp-bladed hoe, its wooden handle worn smooth by the grip of a father and his father before him, was added to the growing pile. The worn-out sickles used for harvesting rice, the bamboo baskets for carrying vegetables, the wheelbarrow with its squeaky wheel, all were collected, registered, and became the property of the commune. The logic was simple. With collective farming, all tools should be shared. But the result was a quiet tragedy of neglect. A tool that belongs to everyone is cared for by no one. The carefully maintained implements soon fell into disrepair. Even more personal possessions were claimed by the collective. The family's pig, or the few chickens that scratched in the dirt yard, often a crucial source of supplementary nutrition or income, were absorbed into communal livestock pens. Perhaps most symbolically, the family wok, the heavy, curved iron pan that was the heart of the Chinese kitchen, the vessel in which every meal was cooked, was taken away. These woks, the cadres explained, were needed for a more important purpose, to be melted down to make steel for the nation. Private kitchens grew cold and silent. The hearth, once the center of family life, became a dusty, unused space. All meals were now to be taken in the new communal canteens, or mess halls. This process of collectivization was presented to the people as a form of liberation. They were being freed from the drudgery of private labor, from the narrow-minded concerns of the individual household. They were now part of a grand, modern, and efficient system. For some, especially the young and landless, this promise held a genuine appeal. But for many, especially the older generation, it felt like a quiet and profound hollowing out of their world. It was a loss of the small, tangible certainties that had structured their existence. They had given up their land, their animals, their tools, and even the pot they cooked in. They had placed their entire existence, their very survival, into the hands of the commune, trusting that the promise of collective abundance would be fulfilled. The old world was being dismantled piece by piece, and the shape of the new one was still a frightening and uncertain abstraction.
The sound of slogans. As the physical landscape of the village was being radically transformed, so too was the landscape of sound. The air itself was collectivized. The familiar, organic symphony of rural life, the crowing of a rooster at dawn, the lowing of an ox, the idle chatter of neighbors mending nets by the pond, the laughter of children playing games in the alleyways, this symphony was systematically replaced by a new, constant, and inescapable noise. From tall wooden poles erected in the center of the village square, and sometimes from smaller ones in the fields, loudspeakers crackled to life before the sun had even risen. They sputtered and hissed, and then began to broadcast their messages, a relentless stream of sound that would fall silent only late into the night, long after the exhausted villagers had retired to their communal dormitories. The broadcasts were a carefully curated mix of revolutionary songs with rousing martial tunes, political speeches from distant leaders in Beijing, and above all, an endless repeating loop of slogans. These slogans were the linguistic engine of the Great Leap Forward, designed to be simple, memorable, and powerful. "Overtake Britain and America in 15 years, the metallic voices would declare, a promise of impossible speed that through sheer repetition began to feel like an achievable goal. "More, faster, better, cheaper," they would chant, a mantra for industrial and agricultural production that ignored the delicate balance required for either.
Slogans praised the people's communes as bridges to communism and celebrated labor as a glorious act of revolutionary devotion. A little hardship now, 1,000 years of happiness later, they promised, framing the current struggle as a small down payment on an infinite future of bliss. These slogans were not just meant to be passively heard, they were meant to be absorbed and repeated, to become a part of the people's own inner monologue. In the vast, collectivized fields, work teams were organized to chant in unison as they labored. The rhythmic shouting was supposed to synchronize their movements, to spur them on, to transform their individual exhaustion into a collective, unstoppable energy. A cadre would call out a line, "What is our goal?" and the workers would shout back in response, "To build a new world." The slogans were not confined to the airwaves. They were written everywhere, becoming the new wallpaper of the nation. They were painted in huge, bold characters on the sides of buildings, on the walls of the new communal canteens, and on great red banners that were stretched across village entrances. They were scrawled onto the sides of carts and tractors, a constant visual and auditory reminder of the nation's singular, all-consuming purpose. The slogans were a promise of progress, a relentless drumbeat of momentum designed to drown out any creeping doubts or questions. Yet beneath this constant, deafening barrage of official sound, a different kind of silence began to grow and spread. It was the silence in the now empty kitchens, where the intimate sounds of family meals were no longer heard. It was the silence of private conversation, as people became increasingly careful with their words, learning that any talk not aligned with the official slogans could be dangerous. The slogans spoke with absolute certainty of a future filled with overflowing granaries and rivers of steel,
But for many, the loudest, most persistent sound was the quiet, gnawing question in their own minds, a question about where exactly tomorrow's meal would come from, a question that the loudspeakers never answered. The noise was everywhere, but the communication of truth had ceased.
The first signs of strain. In the very early days of the Commune, during the late summer and autumn of 1958, the air was thick with a revolutionary optimism that was almost tangible. The communal dining halls, still serving food from the grain reserves of the last private harvest, were relatively full. There was a novelty and a sense of shared purpose that, for a time, masked the profound dislocations of collectivization. People worked with a genuine, if frantic, fervor, believing that their collective labor was a direct contribution to building a new, powerful China. They were part of a historic movement, and the energy of the crowd was infectious. But as the seasons began to turn, and the initial enthusiasm gave way to the monotonous reality of collective life, the first quiet, almost imperceptible signs of strain began to appear. These were not dramatic failures, but small, hairline cracks appearing in the grand facade of the dream, cracks that were easy to ignore at first, but which hinted at deeper structural flaws. It often started with the food, a meal in the communal canteen that was slightly less substantial than the one the day before. The portion of rice or wheat gruel might be imperceptibly smaller. The vegetable stew, once rich with cabbage and turnips, might now seem more watery, with the vegetables themselves becoming scarcer. The officials managing the canteens would offer simple explanations. It was a temporary measure, they would say, a small collective sacrifice needed to support a project elsewhere. The stored grain from the previous bountiful private harvests was being consumed at an alarming rate to feed thousands of people in the new, free canteens, and the hastily organized collective system was proving far less efficient at producing a replacement. The old systems had been dismantled before the new ones were truly functional, creating a dangerous gap. The strain was also visible in the tools and the land. The farming implements, now stored in communal sheds, were no longer anyone's personal responsibility. A hoe with a loose head or a plow with a dull blade would be used until it broke, then simply cast aside. The careful maintenance that individual families had practiced for generations was lost in the anonymity of collective ownership.
The land itself began to suffer. The most experienced farmers, the old men who knew the specific character of each field, which ones needed more water, which ones had richer soil, found their deep, practical wisdom dismissed. They were derided as conservatives stuck in the old ways. In their place, party cadres, often young men with little or no agricultural experience, but armed with revolutionary zeal and pamphlets detailing scientific farming methods, dictated the terms of cultivation. These new methods, such as planting seeds incredibly close together under the false belief that this would create a stronger, unified crop, were implemented without question. The elders watched in silence, knowing from a lifetime of experience that the overcrowded seedlings would choke each other out, leading to a disastrously poor yield. But to voice this knowledge was to risk being branded a rightist, an enemy of progress. So they held their tongues. These were the first signs: the thinning soup, the broken tools, the misguided planting. They were small, quiet warnings from reality, pushing back against the grand, ideological blueprint. And for those who were paying attention, they were deeply unsettling omens of what was to come.
The communal hall was not a hearth, but a hall. In the old world, the center of warmth, nourishment, and family was the kitchen hearth, a small, private space where a family's story was told in the steam of cooking rice and the sizzle of vegetables in a well-loved wok. That heart was now cold. It had been replaced by a new, vast, and public center, the communal dining hall. In some villages, these were newly constructed buildings, hastily erected with raw timber and packed earth, smelling of damp soil and green wood.
They were long, cavernous, and drafty structures, designed to hold hundreds of people at once. In other places, an ancestral temple or the home of a former landlord was repurposed, its sacred or once private spaces now filled with rows of long, rough-hewn wooden tables and simple backless benches. At night, the only light came from a few dim oil lanterns or bare low-wattage bulbs hung high from the rafters, casting a weak, flickering glow that created more shadows than it dispelled. The hall was a place of enforced community, a physical manifestation of the idea that the individual family unit was now obsolete, absorbed into the greater body of the commune. In the first weeks, there was a certain novelty to it, a sense of revolutionary excitement. The slogan, "Serve the People," was painted on a banner over the serving area, and the promise of Chi Fan Buyao Chen, or "Eat rice without paying," was a powerful and intoxicating idea, especially for the poorest peasants who had spent their entire lives worrying about their next meal. To be able to simply walk into a hall and be given a bowl of food felt like a miracle, a tangible sign that the promised communist paradise was truly at hand. The initial meals were often plentiful, cooked in massive iron vats using the grain and produce that had been confiscated from the private stores of the villagers. The halls were noisy then, filled with the boisterous sounds of a community embarking on a great adventure together. There was conversation, laughter, and the confident pronouncements of the local cadres about the glorious future they were all building. For a fleeting moment, the communal hall felt like a celebration, a testament to the power and generosity of the collective.
But the dream of the bottomless rice pot was a shallow one, and it was soon drained. The transition from novelty to grim reality was slow, subtle, and inexorable. It began with the quality of the food. The rich, savory stews of the first weeks began to thin out, the chunks of meat or vegetables becoming fewer and farther between, until the stew was little more than hot water with a few lonely leaves floating in it. The rice, once white and fluffy, was replaced by a coarse, grayish gruel made from yams, turnips, or whatever bulk material was available. This gruel was often thin and watery, providing the illusion of a full bowl, but offering little in the way of actual sustenance. The taste of life became monotonous and bland, a single unchanging note of boiled starch. The portions, too, began to shrink. The ladles used by the servers in the canteen kitchen seemed to get smaller. A full bowl became a half-full bowl, and then a shallow layer at the bottom. The cadres explained it was necessary to be frugal, to conserve grain for the state, for the great project of industrialization. As the food dwindled, the atmosphere in the hall transformed. The boisterous noise of the early days evaporated, replaced by an oppressive, functional silence. The dominant sound was no longer human conversation, but the hollow clatter of hundreds of enamel or wooden bowls being placed on the tables, and the grim, rhythmic scrape of chopsticks against the bottom of those bowls, a desperate attempt to gather every last grain, every last drop of liquid. The hall became a theater of silent observation and quiet tension. People stopped looking at each other's faces and started looking at each other's bowls. A furtive glance to the left, a quick peek to the right. A constant, anxious calculus was taking place in every mind. Did he get more than me? Is her soup thicker? The shared meal, meant to foster unity, instead became a source of suspicion and division. A quiet geography of hunger was mapped out on the long tables, and envy, a poison to the collective spirit, began to seep into the silence. This public eating arrangement also represented a profound emotional loss. It severed the intimate connection between food and family. A mother could no longer cook a special, nourishing dish for a sick child. A husband could no longer save a choice piece of food for his wife. Parents had to watch their children eat the same meager portions as everyone else, powerless to provide them with more. The act of providing, one of the most fundamental expressions of parental love and responsibility, was taken away from them. All were equal in their hunger, and this equality felt less like liberation and more like a shared prison. The children, quick to adapt, learned not to ask for more. They simply ate what was given, their eyes wide and their movements slow. The hall, with its dim lighting and long shadows, became a place where families sat together, yet felt utterly alone, each individual trapped in their own private bubble of hunger and anxiety. Adding to the bitterness was the growing awareness that not everyone was equal. Rumors would circulate in whispers about the small kitchens reserved for the senior cadres. While the masses ate watery gruel, the leaders, it was said, enjoyed better food, including meat and fine grain, reinforcing the ancient pattern of a ruling class that preached sacrifice while living in relative comfort. The communal hall, conceived as the engine room of utopia, had become its most poignant and damning symbol of failure. It was the place where the grand promise of abundance was confronted daily by the stark reality of the empty bowl.
The backyard furnaces. One of the most audacious and ultimately catastrophic pillars of the Great Leap Forward was the national campaign to produce steel. Steel was the ultimate symbol of modernity, the backbone of industrial power. Chairman Mao, captivated by the idea of rapid, decentralized industrialization, made a stunning declaration. In a single year, 1958, China would double its steel output, rocketing from just over 5 million tons to 10.7 million tons. This was a goal that defied all conventional industrial logic and capacity. The nation's existing steel mills, though working around the clock, could not possibly meet such a target. The solution, born of Mao's unshakable faith in the power of mass mobilization, was both ingenious and fantastical. The people themselves would make the steel. The campaign would not be confined to industrial centers. It would be a national crusade, with every commune, every village, every urban neighborhood participating. And so began one of the most surreal and destructive episodes of the 20th century, the era of the backyard furnace. Almost overnight, the landscape of China was transformed by the appearance of these small, crude kilns. They sprouted like strange earthen mushrooms in every available open space. They were built in the middle of fields that should have been used for growing crops, in village squares, in schoolyards, and literally in the backyards of people's homes. There was no standard design. They were constructed from whatever materials were at hand. Most were simple cylinders or domes made of clay and brick, reinforced with mud and straw. They varied in size, but most were only a few meters high, primitive and inefficient by any industrial standard. A feverish, almost manic energy gripped the nation as millions of people were mobilized to build and operate these furnaces. Peasants who had spent their lives tending crops were now declared steel workers. Teachers, students, doctors, and office workers were all commanded to leave their posts and join the great battle for steel. The work was relentless, continuing day and night. The glow from tens of thousands of these furnaces lit up the night sky across the country, casting an eerie, flickering orange light that painted the clouds and filled the air with a thick, acrid smoke.
To feed these ravenous new furnaces, a nationwide scrap metal drive of unprecedented scale was launched. The people were told that every piece of iron was a contribution to the revolution, a weapon in the fight to overtake the West. And so, they gave everything. The campaign began with the collection of scrap, but quickly escalated into a systematic stripping of the nation's available metal. Farmers were ordered to turn in their own tools of production, their iron plows, their harrows, their sickles and hoes. These were the very implements needed for the upcoming harvest, but the cadres insisted that steel was the priority. The logic was that with the new steel, China could build tractors and modern implements, making the old tools obsolete. The sacrifice was for a modern future. The drive then moved from the fields into the homes. Families were forced to surrender their iron cooking woks, the essential vessel of the Chinese kitchen. They gave up their metal gates, their door hinges, the iron rings on their wooden buckets, the nails from their furniture.
In the cities, people tore out radiators from buildings and ripped up iron fences from parks. Anything and everything made of iron was collected, broken up, and hauled to the nearest backyard furnace. The belief, fueled by ceaseless propaganda, was that all of this metal, when melted down in the heat of the kilns and combined with iron ore and coal, would be reborn as high-quality steel, the building block of a new powerful nation. The reality, however, was a tragedy born of ignorance of basic chemistry and metallurgy. The backyard furnaces were simply incapable of reaching the incredibly high temperatures required to produce steel. The heat they generated was only enough to create pig iron, a low-quality, brittle, and carbon-heavy metal that was almost completely useless. As the molten metal was tapped from the furnaces and cooled, it formed into lumpy, misshapen masses that would shatter like pottery if struck with a hammer. It could not be used for construction, for making tools, or for any of the industrial purposes for which it was intended. Yet the campaign raged on. Local officials, under immense pressure to meet their quotas, would report any metal produced as steel, regardless of its quality. Millions of tons of this useless pig iron began to pile up in communes across China, great, silent monuments to a misguided dream and a colossal waste of human effort, resources, and time.
Work beyond endurance. The frantic, all-consuming push for steel was mirrored by a parallel campaign of equal intensity in the fields of agriculture. The logic of the Great Leap Forward dictated that just as industrial output could be doubled through sheer revolutionary will, so too could agricultural yields. The cadres, themselves under immense pressure from their superiors to report ever more spectacular harvests, drove the peasants to work at a pace that was not just demanding, but physically unsustainable. The ancient natural rhythms of farming, which were based on a deep experiential understanding of the seasons, the weather, and human limits, were completely abandoned. They were dismissed as backward and inefficient. In their place came a new militarized approach to labor. The traditional workday, beginning at dawn, with a long rest during the oppressive heat of midday and ending at dusk, was declared a relic of a lazy, individualistic past. Work in the fields now continued around the clock, 24 hours a day. The vast, collectivized fields were illuminated at night by the flickering, uncertain light of oil lanterns, torches, or sometimes the eerie orange glow from the nearby backyard furnaces. The peasants were organized into work brigades, much like soldiers in an army, and marched out to the fields for punishingly long shifts that could last 12, 16, or even more hours at a stretch. There was no weekend, no day of rest. The work was endless and all-encompassing. Sleep became a stolen luxury, grabbed in short, exhausted bursts between shifts, often in crude shelters built at the edge of the fields. The human body was seen not as something to be nourished and respected, but as another resource to be exploited, a machine that could be pushed to its absolute limit, and then beyond, in the service of the state. Exhaustion became the default state of being. It was a deep, bone-wearying fatigue that blurred the days and nights into a single, monotonous continuum of labor. The line between a sense of duty to the revolution and the primal instinct for sheer survival became indistinguishable. People worked because they were told to, because not working meant punishment, and because they were caught in a tide of collective frenzy from which there was no escape.
This relentless drive for output was coupled with the mandatory implementation of a series of new, untested, and ultimately disastrous agricultural techniques. These methods were concocted by theorists and political leaders, including Mao himself, who had little practical knowledge of farming. They were presented as scientific breakthroughs that would unlock the hidden potential of the land. One of the most famous and catastrophic of these was the practice of close planting. Based on the flawed idea that plants of the same class would not compete with each other, cadres ordered peasants to sow seeds many times more densely than tradition dictated. The propaganda posters of the era depicted fantastical images of wheat fields so thick and strong that children could sit on top of the stalks without bending them. The reality was that the overcrowded seedlings starved each other of sunlight, water, and nutrients, leading to withered stalks and a drastically reduced yield. Another widely enforced technique was deep plowing. Peasants were ordered to dig down a meter or more into the earth based on the belief that this would allow the roots to grow deeper and access more nutrients. In reality, this practice often brought infertile subsoil to the surface, burying the rich topsoil and severely damaging the structure and fertility of the land for years to come. To question these new methods, to suggest that the old ways might be better, was an act of political suicide. An experienced farmer who dared to voice his skepticism would be immediately branded a conservative or a rightist, publicly shamed in a struggle session, and accused of trying to sabotage the great leap forward. And so the people worked in silence, their bodies aching, their spirits slowly being crushed under the weight of the endless, pointless labor. They knew the seeds were being planted too closely. They knew the deep plowing was ruining the soil. They were caught in a tragic paradox. They were being forced to participate in the active destruction of their own future harvest, the very food that was supposed to sustain them through the coming winter. The fields, once a source of life and sustenance, had been transformed into vast, open-air factories of exhaustion, where human will was pitted against the laws of nature in a battle that nature would inevitably win.
The vanishing harvests. As the autumn of 1958 arrived, a season that should have been dedicated to the careful and deliberate gathering of the year's crops, a strange and dangerous phenomenon began to ripple across the country. From the offices of communes in every province, reports of unbelievable, miraculous harvests began to flood the bureaucratic channels leading to Beijing. Local officials, locked in a fierce competition with neighboring communes and desperate to demonstrate their revolutionary zeal, began to wildly inflate their grain production numbers. A field that, in a good year, might have produced 1 ton of rice was now reported on official documents as having produced 5 tons, or 10 tons, or even more. These fantastical figures were not just numbers on a page. They were celebrated as irrefutable proof of the brilliant success of the Great Leap Forward. The People's Daily, the official newspaper of the Communist Party, ran front-page headlines announcing these Sputniks of the fields, named after the Soviet satellite, to signify a quantum leap in production. Propaganda artists worked overtime, creating vibrant posters that depicted scenes of impossible abundance. Smiling, healthy peasants standing waist-deep in golden oceans of wheat, pumpkins the size of cartwheels, and corn cobs as long as a man's arm. The problem was that this monumental harvest existed only on paper and in the realm of propaganda. In the real world, the actual harvest was shaping up to be a catastrophic failure. The reasons were manifold. The diversion of a massive portion of the rural labor force to the backyard furnace campaign meant that there simply were not enough able-bodied people left to work in the fields. Millions of men, the strongest workers, were busy melting walks and plows instead of reaping the grain. The crops that did grow were often tended by the elderly, women, and children, who lacked the strength to manage the harvest effectively. Furthermore, the disastrous agricultural experiments of close planting and deep plowing had severely damaged yields across vast areas of the country. What little grain did ripen was often left to rot on the stalk because there was no one to cut it, or it was harvested and then left in piles in the fields because there was no one to transport it to the threshing grounds.
The state, however, was operating in a world of manufactured reality. The central government in Beijing, receiving and believing the wildly inflated reports from the provinces, was convinced that the nation was experiencing a grain surplus of unprecedented proportions. Based on these false numbers, the state bureaucracy did what it had always done. It set its procurement quotas.
It calculated the percentage of the harvest that the communes were required to turn over to the state to feed the cities, supply the army, and to export abroad in exchange for industrial machinery. But because the state was calculating its share based on a phantom harvest, the quotas were impossibly high. They were often larger than the entire actual harvest of a commune. When the state procurement teams arrived in the villages, they came with documents that authorized them to take a specific, massive tonnage of grain. The local cadres, who had been the ones to report the false numbers in the first place, were now trapped. To admit they had lied was to face ruin, and so, to save themselves, they led the procurement teams to the communal granaries and handed over almost everything. The grain vanished, first on paper, into the ledgers of a delusional bureaucracy, and then, tragically and irrevocably, it vanished from the granaries, from the canteens, and from the bowls of the very people who had planted it. The greatest harvest in history had been declared, and it was about to trigger the greatest famine.
Whispers in the night. As the initial feverish enthusiasm of the Great Leap Forward began to cool and curdle into a grim, exhausting routine of hunger and ceaseless labor, the public performance of the day gave way to the hidden truths of the night. During the daylight hours, the village was a stage. People wore a carefully constructed mask of conformity. They went to the fields and chanted the slogans with as much energy as their weary bodies could muster. They attended the mandatory political meetings in the evenings, their faces betraying no emotion as they listened to the cadres recite the latest editorials from the People's Daily, filled with triumphant reports of steel production and bumper harvests. They applauded when they were supposed to applaud and raised their fists in solidarity on cue. This was the world of public speech, a world where only one opinion was permitted, where joy and enthusiasm for the revolution were mandatory. But when the meetings ended and people retreated into the darkness and relative privacy of their dwellings, often now crowded, impersonal communal dormitories, the masks would slip. In the tight, suffocating spaces, separated from their neighbors only by a thin wall of wood or packed earth, the truth would begin to surface in whispers. These were dangerous conversations, fragmented and fraught with fear. A husband might turn to his wife on their shared sleeping platform and murmur about the gnawing ache in his stomach. A woman might whisper to a trusted, lifelong neighbor about the useless, brittle metal they were producing at the furnace, or about the sight of ripe grain rotting in the fields for lack of hands to harvest it. These whispers were a fragile rebellion, a quiet but insistent affirmation of a reality that was being aggressively and officially denied. They were a way of confirming to one another that they were not crazy, that the hunger they felt was real, that the exhaustion was not a personal failing, but a shared condition.
The danger was immense. The commune system was designed for total surveillance. The concept of privacy was seen as bourgeois and counter-revolutionary. A zealous neighbor, hoping to earn favor with the cadres or perhaps an extra food ration, might overhear a stray word of complaint and report it. Children were sometimes encouraged at school to report on the backward thoughts of their own parents. The political machinery of the state reached into the most intimate corners of life. To be caught expressing doubt was to risk everything. The punishment was swift and public. An offender would be subjected to a struggle session, a brutal and humiliating ritual of public shaming. They would be dragged before the entire village or work brigade. Their crimes, complaining about the food, questioning a policy, showing a bad attitude, would be read aloud. Neighbors and even family members would be pressured to come forward and denounce the accused, to hurl insults and accusations at them.
The sessions often ended with the accused being forced to make a groveling confession, sometimes accompanied by physical abuse. The goal was to crush the individual's spirit and to terrorize everyone else into silence. And so, a pervasive and suffocating culture of silence took hold. People learned to police not just their words, but their own thoughts. They developed a second sense for who could be trusted and with what. A glance, a shared sigh, a momentary look of despair in another's eyes, these became a form of silent communication, a way of acknowledging the shared suffering without speaking a single dangerous word. The whispers in the night were the sound of the human spirit refusing to be entirely extinguished. They were a testament to the enduring need for connection and shared truth, even in a world where the truth was a crime. While the loudspeakers blared their triumphant lies into the day, the quiet, fearful whispers in the darkness held the real, tragic story of the Great Leap Forward. They were the first drafts of a history that would not be written down for many years, a history preserved only in the fleeting, whispered memories of the survivors.
The empty bowl. The whispers of doubt that had circulated in the darkness were soon drowned out by a much louder, more primal, and more pervasive reality, the insistent, gnawing cry of hunger. The problem of food was no longer a matter of thinning soup or shrinking portions. It was a matter of the empty bowl. In the great communal dining halls, the enormous vats that had once steamed with rice and stew now held only a meager, watery gruel, often stretched with indigestible fillers. The act of eating became a solemn, desperate ritual. Families would line up, holding their identical enamel or wooden bowls, and receive a single ladle of this thin liquid. There was no second helping. There was nothing more. They would carry their bowls to the long, silent tables and stare into their shallow depths, where a few specks of grain or shredded leaves floated in a cloudy, brownish water. This was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The empty bowl, once just a piece of dishware, was now the central, defining metaphor for their existence. It was a physical object that perfectly mirrored the hollow, aching void in their stomachs. It was a symbol of a promise that had been not just broken, but inverted. The promise of a life free from hunger had delivered a hunger more absolute and inescapable than any they had ever known. This hunger was a constant, physical presence. It was a dull, persistent ache that started in the stomach but soon colonized the entire body and mind. It clouded the vision, made the ears ring, and filled the limbs with a heavy, leaden weakness. It slowed every movement, making the simple act of walking from the dormitory to the fields an ordeal of immense effort. The world, once full of colors, sounds, and smells, began to fade into a gray, muted landscape. The only thing that remained sharp and vivid was the thought of food. It became an obsession, a relentless monologue that played in the mind from the moment of waking to the moment of exhausted, fitful sleep. People would dream of food, of steaming buns, of thick noodle soup, of a simple bowl of white rice. They would wake up with the ghost of a taste on their tongue, a cruel reminder of what they had lost. Their conversations, when they dared to speak, inevitably turned to food. They would recall in meticulous, loving detail the meals they had eaten years ago, describing the textures and flavors with an almost religious reverence.
As the official food supply dwindled to almost nothing, a desperate, silent war against the landscape began. People started to forage for anything at all, that could possibly fill the emptiness in their stomachs. They stripped the bark from elm trees, boiling it into a bitter, slimy paste. They dug up roots and wild grasses, things they had never considered edible before. They ground corn cobs, peanut shells, and rice husks into a coarse, sawdust-like flour that tore at the insides but provided the illusion of fullness. In some of the worst-hit areas, people ate a type of white clay known as Guanyin soil, named after the goddess of mercy. It filled the stomach and stopped the pains of hunger for a short time, but it had no nutritional value and could create intestinal blockages that were often fatal. The landscape itself was slowly consumed, stripped bare of anything that could be eaten. The land, which had once been a source of life, was now being devoured by the very people it was meant to sustain. The communal system, which had taken their private property and promised security in return, had failed so completely that they were reduced to the most primitive state of existence, competing with insects for leaves on a tree. The empty bowl was the final verdict. They had given up their land, their tools, their walks, their freedom, and their labor. In return, they had been left with a hollow piece of wood and a hunger that consumed everything.
Children of the Famine. Narrative. Of all the terrible sights of the famine, the most heartbreaking, the most damning, was the sight of the children. Childhood itself became a casualty of the Great Leap Forward. The sound that is most synonymous with childhood, the sound of laughter, vanished from the villages. The courtyards and alleyways, which should have been filled with the shouts and games of children, fell into an unnatural, unsettling silence. The young, whose small, growing bodies required constant nourishment more than anyone, were the first and most vulnerable victims of the deepening crisis. They began to waste away, their decline a slow, visible tragedy that their parents were forced to watch day by day with an agonizing sense of helplessness. The physical signs were unmistakable. Their once chubby limbs grew thin and stick-like. The playful energy that had once propelled them through the day was replaced by a profound and listless apathy. They would sit for hours, unmoving, their large, dark eyes staring blankly at nothing. Too weak to play, too weak to even cry. A particular form of malnutrition, kwashiorkor, became terrifyingly common. It gave the children a ghostly, unsettling appearance. While their arms and legs were skeletal, their bellies would swell grotesquely with fluid, a condition known as edema. Their hair would lose its pigment, turning a pale, rusty brown, and would fall out in clumps. Their skin would develop strange, patchy rashes. They were feigning echoes of the children they had once been, their life force slowly being extinguished. For their parents, this was a unique and profound form of torture. The most fundamental instinct of any parent is to feed and protect their child, but in the commune, this instinct was thwarted at every turn. There was no extra food to give. There was no secret store of grain to draw from. A mother, her own body racked with hunger, would look at her weakening child and have nothing to offer but her own meager, watery ration from the canteen, a ration that was barely enough to keep herself alive. The act of providing, the very definition of parenthood, was rendered impossible. This powerlessness was a deep psychological wound. They were failing their children in the most basic way, and it was not their fault. Yet the guilt and despair were overwhelming. The famine stole not just their health, but their entire childhood. The small rituals and joys that define a young life disappeared. There were no sweets, no special treats for a birthday, no stories told at bedtime because everyone was too exhausted to speak. Schools across the countryside began to close. The children were too weak and malnourished to make the journey to the schoolhouse, and even if they could, they lacked the mental energy to concentrate or learn. The teachers, themselves starving, were often too weak to teach. The generation that was supposed to be the proud inheritors of the glorious communist future, the children who were supposed to be the successors to the revolution, were instead being systematically consumed by its catastrophic failure. Their silent, listless presence in the desolate villages was a constant, living indictment of the lies being broadcast from the loudspeakers. While the official propaganda spoke of unprecedented success and a happy, prosperous populace, the reality was in the eyes of these starving children. Their silence was louder than any slogan, their swollen bellies a more honest statistic than any inflated grain report.
They were the human price of a political dream, a generation sacrificed on the altar of ideology.
The price of reporting lies. The Great Famine was not a natural disaster. It was not primarily caused by floods or droughts, though these were the reasons the state would later offer to the world. It was a man-made catastrophe, an administrative famine, born of a system that had become completely detached from reality. The engine of this catastrophe was the institutionalization of dishonesty. The core of the problem lay with the vast army of local officials and party cadres who managed the communes. These men were caught in a brutal and inescapable political trap. From their superiors in the county and provincial governments, the pressure to report success was relentless and absolute. The entire political culture of the Great Leap Forward was a frantic competition of revolutionary enthusiasm. Cadres were praised, promoted, and rewarded for reporting astonishingly high production figures. To report a modest or average harvest was to be seen as lazy or uninspired. To report a failure, to admit that the new methods were not working, was to commit political suicide. It meant being labeled a rightist, a pessimist, a counter-revolutionary. It meant being stripped of one's position, subjected to public humiliation in a struggle session, and possibly being sent to a labor camp. Your career, your reputation, your family's safety, it all depended on reporting good news, whether it was true or not. Faced with this stark choice between political survival and telling the truth, the vast majority of officials chose to protect themselves. They began to fabricate their reports. The act of writing these lies must have been a moment of profound cognitive dissonance. A cadre would sit at his desk knowing that the fields outside his window had yielded a poor harvest, that the people in his commune were already showing signs of hunger. And yet he would take his pen and write down a number that was 5 or 10 times the actual amount, declaring a bumper crop that existed only in his imagination and on that official document. He would then send this report up the chain of command, where it would be aggregated with other equally false reports from neighboring communes. These lies would travel up the bureaucratic ladder, gaining credibility with each step until they landed on the desks of the central planners in Beijing as hard, undeniable facts. The leaders, insulated from the grim reality on the ground, truly believed that China was awash in a sea of surplus grain.
This system of lies created a deadly feedback loop. The central government, operating on the basis of these fantastical production figures, made two fatal decisions. First, it dramatically increased the amount of grain it took from the countryside. Believing the communes were overflowing with food, the state's procurement quotas were set at impossibly high levels. Procurement teams, armed with official documents demanding a specific tonnage, would descend on the villages. The local cadres, having created this problem with their false reports, were now forced to meet these quotas to maintain the fiction. They led the teams to the communal granaries and allowed them to take everything, right down to the seed grain needed for the next year's planting. Sometimes they even had to lead anti-hiding teams to conduct brutal house-to-house searches, confiscating any pathetic handful of grain a family might have hidden away. Second, convinced of its domestic surplus, China massively increased its food exports to the Soviet Union and other socialist countries in exchange for industrial technology. And it provided generous food aid to other nations to showcase the success of its model. While its own people were beginning to starve, shiploads of Chinese grain were being sent overseas. The price of reporting lies was paid not by the officials who wrote them, but in the lives of the millions of people who starved because the state had taken their last mouthful of food based on a harvest that never was.
The fear of speaking truth. For an ordinary villager,
trapped at the bottom of this pyramid of deceit. To speak the truth was an act of unimaginable courage, and one that courted disaster. In the atmosphere of political terror that permeated the Great Leap Forward, a single, honest word could be a death sentence. To complain aloud about the gnawing hunger, to question the wisdom of melting down useful farm tools in the backyard furnaces, or to simply state the obvious fact that the harvest was a failure, any of these was to commit a serious political crime. It was not merely dissent, it was spreading rumors, attacking the party, or slandering the socialist system. The regime had developed a powerful and terrifying apparatus for enforcing conformity and crushing any sign of opposition. The most common tool was the public struggle session. This was not a debate or a discussion. It was a ritual of psychological and sometimes physical violence designed to break the will of the individual and terrorize the community into submission. Imagine a farmer, unable to bear the sight of his hungry children any longer, who mutters a complaint in the canteen. He is overheard. That evening, he is dragged to the front of a mass meeting in the village square. He is forced to stand on a small stool, his head bowed, a dunce cap on his head with his crimes written on it. The local cadre begins the denunciation, shouting slogans and accusing him of being a rightist element trying to sabotage the glorious Great Leap Forward. Then the ordeal begins in earnest. His neighbors, his friends, people he has known his entire life are now pressured to come forward and struggle against him. They're coached to hurl insults, to spit at him, to accuse him of all manner of fabricated crimes. "He was always lazy. I heard him praise the old society," another might lie. The pressure to participate was immense. To remain silent was to risk being seen as a sympathizer, of being dragged up onto the stage next. The session could go on for hours, a relentless assault of verbal abuse and public humiliation. The goal was to isolate the victim completely, to make him feel abandoned by his own community, to strip him of his dignity and his identity. Many of these sessions ended with beatings, and the victim was often sentenced to the hardest labor on the lowest food rations, a fate that, in a time of famine, was often a slow and certain death. This pervasive fear created a suffocating atmosphere of paranoia and distrust. It atomized society, breaking the bonds of family and community. People learned to police not just their words, but their facial expressions, their very thoughts. A frown at the wrong moment, a sigh of weariness, could be interpreted as a sign of bad attitude. Everyone was a potential informer. A hungry neighbor might report a complaint in the desperate hope of receiving a reward, an extra sweet potato, a slightly larger ration of gruel. A child indoctrinated at school with the virtue of revolutionary vigilance might innocently report a pessimistic comment made by their own father at home. The fear was a constant, invisible presence. It forced people to become actors in their own lives, to perform a role of cheerful, enthusiastic support for a system that was killing them. They went to the fields and pretended to work with vigor. They attended the political meetings and chanted the slogans with feigned passion. They learned to live with a painful internal split between the public lie they were forced to perform and the private truth they were terrified to even think. This enforced silence was the critical element that allowed the catastrophe to unfold on such a massive scale. The famine was not just a failure of policy, it was a failure of speech. Millions suffered and perished in a disaster that was officially denied, a tragedy made possible by a silence born of absolute terror.
Quiet acts of survival. In the face of this overwhelming state-sponsored system of hunger and political terror, the human instinct for survival did not simply surrender, it went underground. Denied any official or public means of self-preservation, people turned to a world of quiet, desperate, and deeply personal acts of rebellion. These were not grand gestures of political defiance, but small, secret acts aimed at one simple goal: keeping oneself and one's family alive for one more day. These acts represented a reclamation of the private, a concept that the commune system had tried to eradicate. The most common form of this rebellion was the hiding of food. A family might manage to procure a handful of grain, a few sweet potatoes, or some dried vegetables, perhaps by gleaning forgotten scraps from the harvested fields or through a secret barter. This food was a treasure of unimaginable value, and it had to be hidden with the utmost cunning. They would bury it in a small pot under the packed earth floor of their home, conceal it in the thatch of the roof, or hide it in a hollowed-out section of a wall. The discovery of such a private stash by a cadre would lead to severe punishment, so the act of hiding and retrieving the food was fraught with constant anxiety. Every night, a mother might secretly dig up a single sweet potato, cook it over a tiny, smokeless fire made from twigs, and divide it among her children, a sacrament of survival performed in the shadows. Another crucial act of survival was the cultivation of secret private plots. Although all land officially belonged to the commune, people began to find tiny, overlooked patches of earth to cultivate for themselves. They might clear a small area deep in the woods, on a steep, rocky hillside, or along a remote riverbank. These private plots were often no bigger than a straw hat, but on them a family could grow a few precious vegetables, or a handful of beans. Tending to these plots was a risky endeavor, done at night or in the pre-dawn gloom, away from the watchful eyes of the cadres. The tiny harvest from such a plot could mean the difference between life and death. A parallel economy, a black market of barter and silence, began to emerge. A family with a hidden stash of potatoes might secretly trade some with a neighbor who had managed to catch a few small fish in the river. A carpenter might repair a cadre's furniture in exchange for a small bag of grain. These transactions were based on a fragile, unspoken trust. The foundation of this hidden economy was silence. To know of your neighbor's secret plot or hidden food and not report it was in itself a profound act of solidarity, a quiet conspiracy of survival. People learned to not see, to not hear, to not speak. They traded their silence for the chance to endure.
These desperate measures sometimes pushed people to the very edge of their humanity. They stole from the collective fields at night, a crime for which people were sometimes beaten to death if caught. In the most extreme and horrific circumstances, as the famine reached its peak, there were documented instances of people resorting to cannibalism to survive. These quiet, desperate acts were a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit, but they were also a measure of the system's profound failure. It had stripped people of everything, their property, their dignity, their security, and had driven them back to a state of nature, where the only law was the law of survival. These small, secret acts were a rejection of the collective lie. They were a declaration, made in the dark, that the life of one's own child was more important than the ideological purity of the commune, that an individual survival was a moral good. They were the last, flickering embers of human agency in a world that had tried its utmost to extinguish them.
Villages in decline. As the famine wore on, month after agonizing month, the very fabric of village life, a fabric that had been woven over centuries of shared history and kinship, began to unravel and tear apart. The decline was not sudden and dramatic, but a slow, creeping erosion of life itself. The once bustling villages, which had, even in the early days of the leap, been filled with the frantic energy of collective labor, grew strangely and unnervingly quiet. The lanes and pathways, which should have been alive with the movement of people heading to the fields or the canteens, were now often deserted. The sounds of life, the chatter of women washing clothes at the village pond, the rhythmic thud of a carpenter's hammer, the shouting of children playing, were replaced by an eerie, pervasive stillness. The silence was broken only by the mournful sound of the wind blowing through the bare trees and rattling the loose paper on the window frames.
It was a silence that spoke of absence, of energy drained away, of a community in the process of ceasing to exist. One by one, families began to disappear from public view. As starvation took its toll, people became too weak to leave their homes. The effort required to walk to the canteen for a ladle of thin gruel became too great. Doors that had once been open, a sign of a welcoming and communal life, now remained tightly closed. Behind these closed doors, families were quietly wasting away. A neighbor who had been a fixture of village life for 50 years would simply not be seen one day, and then the next, and then forever. Their absence was a silent announcement of what was happening everywhere. In many places, entire villages began to resemble ghost towns. Homes were abandoned as the families within them perished, or as the few who still had the strength attempted to flee.
These famine refugees would set out on the roads, hoping to find food in a nearby county or city, but their journey was often hopeless. The government, intent on hiding the scale of the disaster and maintaining social control, had set up checkpoints and roadblocks to prevent people from leaving their designated communes. Those who were caught were forcibly returned to their villages to starve. The social bonds that had held the community together for generations were frayed to the breaking point, and often they snapped. The traditions of mutual help and neighborly support faltered under the immense pressure of individual survival. In the desperate search for food, people stole from their neighbors. The fear of being reported for hiding food created a wall of suspicion between households. The ancient traditions surrounding death also collapsed. Normally, a death in the village would be a major communal event with elaborate rituals and shared mourning. Now, deaths were so frequent and people were so weak that there was no energy for ceremony. The dead were often buried in shallow, unmarked graves, without coffins, sometimes in the middle of the night, by a few starving family members. The village, which had for so long been the center of a shared world, a source of identity, security, and meaning, became a place of profound isolation and quiet despair. Its lanes were empty, its houses were filled with a silence that was deeper and more final than any slogan, and its communal spirit had been starved out of existence. The great leap forward, which had promised to build a stronger, more unified community, had instead presided over its complete and utter dissolution.
The grain that never came. In the midst of the deepening despair, the human spirit, with its remarkable capacity for hope, would occasionally grasp at flickering, fragile straws. This hope was often deliberately lit by the local cadres, who were desperate to maintain a semblance of order and prevent a complete collapse of morale. They would call meetings, and with a false air of confidence would tell the starving villagers that the party and Chairman Mao had not forgotten them. They would acknowledge the temporary difficulties but assure them that help was on its way. They would speak with great certainty of massive grain shipments that had been dispatched from other, more prosperous provinces where the harvest had supposedly been bountiful. They would give specific details, painting a vivid picture of trucks and trains laden with rice and wheat, rumbling across the country on a mission of rescue. For a time, these promises worked. The idea that salvation was just over the horizon was a powerful opiate against the pain of the present. People would cling to these words, repeating them to each other in hopeful whispers. The promise of relief, even if it was just a promise, provided a reason to hold on for another day, another week. The village would enter a state of suspended animation, a period of quiet, desperate waiting. The people would watch the dusty, empty roads that led to the village. Every distant cloud of dust, every far-off rumble that might be a truck engine would send a brief electric jolt of hope through the community. Children would be sent to the edge of the village to keep watch, their weak bodies animated by the possibility of food. The villagers would calculate and recalculate when the shipment might arrive. The cadre said it left from Shandong 3 days ago, one might say. It should be here by tomorrow. The communal storehouses,
which had been ruthlessly emptied months before to meet the state's procurement quotas, stood as silent, empty symbols of this hope. Their great wooden doors were shut and barred, but in the minds of the villagers, they were already filled to the rafters with sacks of life-giving grain. The waiting was an agony, a delicate balance between hope and the gnawing fear that it was all a lie.
But the grain never came. The promised shipments were a fiction, a cruel tool of social management designed to buy the authorities a little more time, to keep the people from rioting or fleeing en masse. There were no surplus provinces. There were no fleets of trucks rolling towards them. The entire country was in the grip of the same crisis. Each time a promised delivery date came and went, with the roads remaining stubbornly empty and the storehouses echoing and bare, another layer of trust in the system was stripped away. The initial flicker of hope would die, replaced by a dull, cold, and aching certainty. They had been lied to. They had been abandoned. The realization that no one was coming to save them was a profound psychological blow, perhaps even more devastating than the hunger itself. It was the final confirmation that they were utterly alone, trapped in their dying village with no recourse and no escape. The hope for external rescue died, and with it, the last vestiges of faith in the party and its promises. The villagers were left with only themselves, the barren land around them, and the vast, empty silence of the grain that never came.
The burden of officials. While it is easy to cast all local officials as heartless villains in this tragedy, the reality for many cadres was far more complex and tormenting. These men were the cogs in the great machine of the state, the crucial link between the ideological pronouncements from Beijing and the grim reality on the ground. And many of them were caught in the machine's unforgiving gears. The majority of these local party secretaries and commune leaders were not outsiders. They were men from the villages themselves. They were governing their own kin, their childhood friends, the people they had grown up with and whose families they had known for generations. This position, which should have been one of honor, became a source of unbearable psychological strain. They were torn between two irreconcilable loyalties: their loyalty to the party, which demanded absolute obedience, and their loyalty to their community, which was disintegrating before their very eyes. On one hand, their careers, their political survival, and the well-being of their own immediate families depended entirely on following the orders that came from above. They were under constant pressure to meet the grain procurement quotas, to enforce the disastrous agricultural policies, to organize the backyard furnaces, and to root out any sign of rightist thinking. To fail in any of these tasks was to risk being purged. They knew that if they were removed from their post, they and their families would be cast down into the same pool of starving villagers, stripped of any privilege or protection. This fear was a powerful motivator, pushing many to become rigid and unyielding enforcers of the party's line. These were the men who became petty tyrants, who led the brutal house-to-house searches for hidden grain, who presided over the humiliating struggle sessions, and who callously ignored the suffering around them in a desperate act of self-preservation.
On the other hand, they could not escape the evidence of their own senses. They saw the skeletal limbs and swollen bellies of the children. They heard the desperate, unspoken pleas in the eyes of their neighbors. They walked past the silent houses where they knew entire families had perished. They were not distant bureaucrats reading abstract reports. They were living inside the catastrophe they were helping to create. This daily confrontation with human suffering tormented many of them. Some tried to walk a tightrope of quiet resistance. They would secretly underreport the population of their commune to the county authorities, hoping to receive a lower grain quota. They might classify more land as barren to reduce its expected yield on paper.
When the procurement teams arrived, some cadres would try to hide a portion of the grain, creating a secret reserve to distribute to the most desperate families. They would turn a blind eye to villagers cultivating secret plots or foraging in the hills. These were small, dangerous acts of sabotage against the state's machinery, and they required immense courage. A few brave officials, their consciences pushed past the breaking point, attempted to report the truth up the chain of command. They wrote letters or tried to speak to their superiors, describing the famine in stark, honest terms and begging for relief. This was the most dangerous path of all. The system was designed to punish messengers who brought bad news. Almost invariably, these honest officials were accused of being rightist sympathizers who were exaggerating difficulties and slandering the Great Leap. They were swiftly removed from their posts, publicly disgraced, and often sent to labor camps, their truthful reports buried and ignored. The burden of the officials was the burden of impossible choices. They were the human face of a deadly, inhuman system, trapped between their loyalty to a political ideology and their fundamental humanity. Their stories, full of compromise, cruelty, cowardice, and occasional heroic compassion, are a crucial part of understanding the complex moral landscape of the famine.
The silence of the countryside. The ultimate and most profound marker of the famine's toll was not a number, but a sound, or rather the absence of it. A deep and unnatural silence settled over the vast Chinese countryside, a silence composed of many layers of loss. The most immediate silence was human. The boisterous revolutionary songs that had been chanted in the fields during the early, frantic days of the leap were long gone. The relentless slogans broadcast from the loudspeakers began to fall silent in many villages as the electrical systems failed or as there was simply no one with the energy to maintain them. Even if they worked, the words were now a hollow, mocking echo of a failed promise. The everyday human sounds, the chatter, the arguments, the laughter, had faded away with the strength of the people. The silence of the villages was the silence of exhaustion, despair, and death. But the silence went deeper than that. It was ecological. It was a silence in nature itself, a direct consequence of one of the most bizarre and destructive campaigns of the Great Leap Forward, the Four Pests Campaign. In early 1958, Mao Zedong had identified four creatures as enemies of the people and obstacles to progress: rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. The campaign against the sparrows was pursued with the most fanatical, nationwide zeal. Sparrows were accused of eating vast quantities of grain from the fields, and so, it was reasoned, their complete eradication would lead to a larger harvest. The entire population was mobilized in a great people's war against the birds.
The strategy was one of total exhaustion. On designated days, millions of people across the country would pour out into the streets, fields, and courtyards, banging on anything that could make a noise: pots, pans, wash basins, drums. The relentless, deafening cacophony would last for hours, sometimes for days on end. The goal was to prevent the sparrows from finding any place to land and rest. Terrified, the birds would fly until their small bodies gave out and they literally fell from the sky, dead from exhaustion. People would climb trees to tear down their nests and smash their eggs. The campaign was hailed as a tremendous success, and it is estimated that hundreds of millions of sparrows were killed. The ecological consequences were swift and catastrophic. The leaders who had ordered the campaign had failed to understand a basic fact of biology.
Sparrows ate not only grain, but also a huge number of insects. With their primary natural predator almost completely eliminated, the populations of insects, especially locusts, exploded. In the months and years that followed, great swarms of locusts, unchecked by any natural force, descended upon the already struggling crops. They consumed what little was growing in the fields, delivering a final, devastating blow to the agricultural system. The war against the sparrows had been won, and the price was a plague of insects. And so, the countryside fell even more silent. The cheerful, ubiquitous birdsong that had been the constant, natural soundtrack to rural life was gone. The silence of the fields was no longer just the absence of human activity, it was the absence of nature's own voice. The only sounds that remained were the desolate ones, the rustle of the wind blowing over the barren, insect-eaten fields, the creak of an abandoned water wheel, the lonely cry of a crow. This dead silence was the true sound of the great leap forward, the sound of a world thrown out of balance, the sound of a profound and man-made emptiness.
The cost, measured in millions. The full and horrifying scale of the tragedy that had unfolded in the Chinese countryside was successfully hidden from the outside world and even from most people within China for many years. The government, in absolute control of all information, refused to acknowledge the existence of a famine. Officially, the period from 1959 to 1961 was known as the 3 years of natural disasters. The state's narrative, repeated endlessly in official documents in newspapers, was that the food shortages were the result of a series of unprecedented and unfortunate floods and droughts. While it was true that some regions had experienced adverse weather conditions during these years, these were by no means historically exceptional, and they could not account for the sheer scale of the nationwide collapse in food production. The primary cause was not the weather, it was policy. It was the backyard furnaces that diverted labor from the fields, the disastrous agricultural experiments that ruined the soil, and above all, the massive state grain procurements based on fabricated harvest reports. The natural disaster was, in reality, a political one. The final cost, when historians and demographers were much later able to painstakingly piece together the evidence, was staggering, almost beyond comprehension. They did this by analyzing official census data from the years before and after the leap, looking for anomalies. What they found was a gaping hole in the nation's demography.
Comparing the actual population figures with what they should have been based on normal trends, they were able to calculate the number of excess deaths. The precise number is still debated among scholars, as records were often incomplete or deliberately obscured. But the most widely accepted estimates place the death toll somewhere between 15 million and 55 million people. Even the most conservative of these figures makes the Great Famine the single largest famine in all of human history, and very likely the worst man-made disaster of the 20th century. It is easy for a number so large to become an abstraction, a sterile statistic that loses its human meaning. But it is essential to remember that behind every single digit in that horrifying tally was a human life. A father who worked himself to death in a field, a mother who gave her last bit of food to her child, a child who wasted away in a silent hut, a scholar, a farmer, a village elder. Each death was a family shattered, a name lost, a story that ended in quiet desperation. This was not a story of dramatic battles or heroic last stands. It was a story of a slow, silent, and immense loss of life that unfolded in countless anonymous villages, hidden behind a curtain of lies. The cost was measured not only in the tens of millions who perished from starvation and related diseases, but also in the deep collective trauma that was seared into the memory of the survivors. It was a wound so vast and so profound that the nation could not speak of it for decades. The official silence was a second tragedy, an attempt to erase not only the lives, but the very memory of the victims from the historical record. Catastrophe had become so widespread and so undeniable that even the most insulated and ideological leaders at the highest levels of the Communist Party could no longer ignore it. The triumphant reports had ceased, replaced by hushed but alarming accounts of mass death and social collapse from senior officials who were dispatched to the countryside to investigate. The Great Leap Forward, the magnificent dream of instant communism, was quietly and unceremoniously abandoned. It did not end with a grand announcement of failure or a public apology. There was no moment of official reckoning. Instead, the great experiment simply unraveled, its core policies dismantled piece by piece in a series of pragmatic, life-saving retreats from the brink of total collapse. The backyard furnaces had long since gone cold, their clay walls crumbling, leaving behind vast rusting piles of useless pig iron, surreal monuments to a failed industrial fantasy. The frantic, around-the-clock labor campaigns ceased, as there was no one left with the energy to enforce them or carry them out.
Of collectivization. The system of radical, total collectivization was implicitly acknowledged as a failure. Small, private plots of land were once again permitted. Families were allocated tiny parcels, often just outside their homes, where they were allowed to grow their own vegetables and raise a few chickens or a pig. This small act of returning a measure of economic autonomy to the peasants had an immediate and dramatic effect. People tended to these small plots with a care and devotion they had never shown for the vast, anonymous collective fields. These private plots soon became a crucial source of supplementary food, providing the essential nutrients that the state-run canteens had failed to deliver. The communal dining halls, the very symbol of the commune, began to be shut down. As private plots began to yield produce, families started to cook for themselves again. In some places, the woks that had been confiscated for the steel campaign were returned, or new ones were distributed. The family kitchen, and with it a small but vital sphere of private life, began to reappear. The hearth, cold for 3 years, was lit once more. For the weary survivors of the famine, this slow return to the old ways was not a moment of celebration. There was no joy, only a profound and somber relief. There was too much loss, too much pain, too much death associated with the years of the commune. The fading of the Great Leap was like the morning after a devastating hurricane. The storm had passed, but the landscape was unrecognizable, littered with the wreckage of a shattered world. The people were physically and emotionally exhausted, haunted by the memories of those they had lost. They picked up the pieces of their lives and began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding, not with the fiery optimism of 1958, but with the grim, cautious pragmatism of those who had stared into the abyss and survived. The dream of a great leap into the future was over, leaving a generation of weary survivors to put their trust not in grand promises, but in the simple, tangible reality of a potato they had grown with their own hands. The Great Leap Forward became a subject of profound and pervasive public silence. It was a great, unhealed wound in the national consciousness, a collective trauma so vast that the nation lacked the language or the political space to confront it. The subject was erased from the official history. Textbooks in schools either ignored the period entirely or offered only the brief, misleading explanation of the 3 years of natural disasters, blaming the hardship on bad weather and the machinations of the Soviet Union. The party could not afford to admit that its own policies, guided by its supreme leader, had led to the deaths of tens of millions of its own citizens. To do so would be to undermine the very foundation of its legitimacy. And so, a collective, state-enforced amnesia was imposed from above. For the survivors, the silence was more complex. It was partly a product of political fear. They knew that to speak openly about what had happened was still dangerous, but it was also a form of psychological self-preservation.
The memories were simply too painful to revisit. How do you speak of watching your own children starve? How do you articulate the horror of a village consumed by hunger? The experiences were buried deep within, too terrible to be exhumed into the light of day. And so, the story of the Great Famine was not written down in books or memorialized in museums. It was carried silently and heavily in the minds and hearts of the tens of millions who had lived through it.
Behavior, through ingrained habits, through whispered warnings within the family. An elder would scold a grandchild for leaving a single grain of rice in their bowl, and the admonishment, never waste food, carried the unspoken weight of a history the child could not yet understand. The generation of survivors developed a relationship with food that was almost sacred, an obsession with scarcity that would shape their lives and the lives of their children. This culture of eating bitterness, of enduring hardship without complaint, became a defining characteristic for many. The history became a ghost in the national house, a presence that was felt everywhere, but never seen or acknowledged. It shaped attitudes towards authority, instilling a deep, cautious pragmatism and a profound distrust of grand, ideological promises. The unwritten lesson was clear. Rely on yourself, on your family, and on tangible assets, not on the words of politicians. The official silence of the state and the private silence of the survivors conspired to create a strange historical void. The nation moved on, rebuilding and eventually prospering, but it did so by walking around this immense, unmarked mass grave in its recent past. The truth was preserved not in archives, but in the quiet, unwritten testimony of a generation who had learned the most terrible lessons in silence.
And when the famine subsided, its legacy echoed through the subsequent decades, leaving deep and lasting scars on the demographic, political, and psychological landscape of the nation. The most immediate legacy was demographic. The famine carved a giant hole in the Chinese population. The tens of millions of deaths, combined with the millions of lost births during the period, created a lost generation. This demographic scar would be visible in population pyramids for a century, a permanent statistical monument to the disaster. The generation that survived, particularly those who were children during the famine, carried the physical and psychological marks for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from chronic health problems related to their early malnutrition. The political legacy was equally profound and far-reaching. The catastrophic failure of the Great Leap Forward represented the first major blow to Mao Zedong's personal authority and prestige within the Communist Party. In the aftermath, he was forced to retreat from day-to-day management of the state, and more pragmatic leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping rose to prominence, implementing policies that reversed the radicalism of the leap and stabilized the economy. This, however, created deep and bitter fissures within the party's leadership. Mao grew to resent these men and their capitalist road policies, viewing their retreat from his revolutionary vision as a betrayal. He saw their pragmatism as a threat to the soul of the revolution.
Pragmatic modernizers would fester for several years before exploding in 1966 with the launch of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. In many ways, the Cultural Revolution was Mao's brutal and chaotic attempt to reassert his authority and purge the very officials who had cleaned up the mess of his last great campaign. The famine, therefore, set the stage for the next decade of political turmoil. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was psychological. The experience of the famine seared a deep-seated pragmatism and materialism into the collective Chinese psyche. For generations, the primary goal became security, stability, and the accumulation of enough resources to ensure that such a disaster could never happen again. The deep distrust of grand, utopian ideological projects born from the failure of the Great Leap ironically helped pave the way for the nation's later embrace of market-oriented reforms under Deng Xiaoping. The slogan of that new era, "To get rich is glorious," was the polar opposite of the selfless collective ideology of the Leap. It was a tacit acknowledgement that appealing to individual self-interest and the desire for a better material life was a more powerful and reliable engine for development than revolutionary fervor. The shadow of the Hungry Years created a population that was willing to work incredibly hard and sacrifice much for the promise of economic stability. The legacy of loss was a complex one. It was a story of immense suffering, but also the crucible in which the attitudes that would fuel China's future economic miracle were forged.
The official silence surrounding the Great Leap Forward largely held. The party, while allowing for some criticism of the mistakes of the era, never officially repudiated the campaign entirely or acknowledged the true scale of the man-made famine. The subject remained politically sensitive, a dangerous third rail in any public discussion of the nation's history. However, as China began to reform and open up to the world in the 1980s and 90s, the solid wall of silence began to develop small cracks. A quiet, painstaking process of historical reckoning began, led by courageous scholars, journalists, and survivors both inside and outside of China. This was not a public, state-sponsored Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but a series of scattered individual efforts to uncover and preserve a forbidden history. Scholars like Yang Jiseng, a former Xinhua news agency reporter whose own father had died of starvation during the famine, embarked on a long and perilous journey into the past. Over more than a decade, he traveled to remote parts of the countryside, painstakingly interviewing survivors and gaining access to provincial archives that had been sealed for years. In these dusty, forgotten archives, he found the raw data, the local population registers, the grain procurement records, the internal reports from cadres that told the real story. He documented his findings in his monumental book, Tombstone, a detailed county-by-county account of the famine. The book, banned in mainland China but published in Hong Kong, stands as one of the most important and comprehensive acts of historical reclamation of the 21st century. Others too collected oral histories, preserving the stories of the survivors before they were lost to time. These efforts were a race against both official censorship and the fading of memory.
Modern China. It is the contrast between the gleaming, futuristic skylines of Shanghai and Shenzhen, symbols of the nation's incredible economic success, and the buried history of starvation and suffering that lies in the soil of the countryside. It is the contrast between the party's official narrative of wise and benevolent leadership and the documented reality of a political system that manufactured a catastrophe. The reckoning is far from complete. The history of the Great Leap is still not openly discussed or taught in China, but it is no longer a complete secret. The story exists in books, in documentaries, and online, accessible to those who are determined to find it. The nation has moved forward, building a powerful and modern state, but the echoes of the leap linger. They linger in the memories of the elderly, in the academic work of brave historians, and in the uneasy silence that still surrounds the topic. The quiet reckoning continues, a testament to the enduring power of truth and the human need to understand and account for the darkest chapters of the past.
When stripped of its politics and its immense numbing statistics, begins as a story of a dream. It was a dream born of a genuine and deeply felt desire to lift an ancient nation out of a century of poverty, weakness, and humiliation. It was a vision of a future where no child would go hungry, where China would stand tall and proud among the great powers of the world, and where the immense, latent energy of its people would be unleashed to create a modern
paradise. This dream, in its initial idealistic form, was a powerful and noble one. It inspired millions of ordinary people to believe in the possibility of a better world and to sacrifice everything they had, their land, their labor, their most personal possessions, for what they were told was a common cause, a shared, glorious future. But the story of the Great Leap Forward is also the story of how that beautiful and ambitious dream became a terrifying and deadly warning. It is a warning about the profound dangers of utopianism, the belief that a perfect society can be engineered from above according to a rigid ideological blueprint. It is a warning about what happens when ambition becomes untethered from reality, when revolutionary fervor is valued more than practical knowledge, and when the abstract goal of the collective good is used to justify the suffering of concrete individuals.
Mobilized, could conquer the laws of nature, physics, and economics. It was a dream that had no room for doubt, no tolerance for dissent, and no mechanism for self-correction. When the first signs of failure appeared, the system did not adjust. It doubled down, demanding even greater sacrifices and punishing those who dared to speak the truth. The Great Leap Forward ended, its dream shattered, leaving behind a scarred landscape and a traumatized people. But its lesson endures, a quiet and somber echo in the corridors of modern history, a lesson that is not just for China, but for all of humanity. It teaches us that progress cannot be measured solely in tons of steel produced or in the speed of transformation. It must be measured in human well-being, in dignity, in freedom, and in the right of individuals to live their lives without fear. It teaches us that the wisdom of the farmer who knows the soil is often more valuable than the theories of the distant planner who knows only a map. And above all, it teaches us that the first casualty of any ideology that demands absolute conformity is the truth, and that when the truth dies, millions can die with it. Ambition can build nations and change the world, but the story of the Great Leap Forward is the ultimate tragic warning that ambition, if it is to be a force for good, must never, ever be allowed to forget our shared and fragile humanity.